In 1876, in the red clay hills of Virginia, the Harrison estate sits above a slow river with a white porch that always looks clean and a bell that shines like a promise. From the road, the house tells a simple story: order, grace, and money that never has to raise its voice. On Sundays, the Harrisons ride to church without a squeak in the wagon, their children in pressed collars, and the matriarch, Elizabeth Harrison, steady as a stone. People say her hands are soft and sure, and that she can stand beside pain without fear. People say the family is blessed, and they say it as if saying it makes it true. In the ledger of the town, their name sits in ink that does not fade, and the neighbors bring jars of preserves to their door, and the schoolmaster nods when their boys pass by. A hush rests over the estate like a second roof. It keeps out wind and rumor and blame, and it keeps something else in. Inside those hedges, the year turns by a private clock: seed, harvest, and birth. Birth most of all. The house holds a warm smell of boiled water and clean linen and a faint trace of herbs that never seems to lift. Elizabeth learned midwifery from her mother, and women in the county have trusted her for years. They say no infant leaves her arms in fear. They do not speak of the pattern they have seen or chosen not to see, because the words for it feel like a test that might break the speaker. In the Harrison line, every child arrives with a shadow. Each birth comes as two, and by dusk one is gone. The first twin stays, the second does not. The church book records the living with careful script and leaves the rest to whispers. Neighbors send food and talk about God's will, the river air or weak lungs. They never ask about the spare cradle carried back to the attic at night, or the small room on the east side whose shutters stay closed even in warm weather. They do not ask because order soothes them, and asking is a kind of storm. At the market, women decide the twins were born weak. Men say the river mist is rough on new lungs. The preacher says sorrow is a door heaven uses. People nod as if nodding can carry weight for a mother whose lap is half full. Then they look at Elizabeth and feel relief spread under their ribs like a small flame, because she appears calm, and if the mother appears calm, the world must still be in place. The house itself is a lesson in calm. The planks do not groan, the paint does not peel. A girl shakes sheets from the upstairs window each morning, and the white cloth flares in light like surrender. A brass key hangs from Elizabeth's apron. A pantry smells of yeast and pear. The well is covered and the rope is dry. Every object has a place, and that is soothing to a visitor and dangerous to the truth, because order can hide harm if it shines enough. The Harrison order shines until the eyes sting. From a God's eye, the larger shape is clear. The family is bound by a law no court has written, and that law lives in the body of a woman who thinks she serves love. In her heart, health is not free. It must be paid for in exact measure, and the measure cannot be coined. It must be breath. It must be silence. The first time Elizabeth learned this law, she stood beside a bed where two infants fought for warmth and the world tilted. She taught herself stillness. She taught her hands to move in ways that made a surface look gentle while the world underneath changed. She did not see herself as cruel, she saw herself as precise. Precision feels like mercy to the one who believes in it. The town's memory is short when memory costs status. At gatherings, people praise the Harrison boys and the Harrison fields, and they speak of a wedding that lit the yard like day. No one mentions the morning sounds on delivery days, soft running feet, a door closing fast, then a stillness like a held breath. A few recall tiny coffins once ordered from a carpenter 2 towns away. They tell themselves those were for other families because it is easier to believe grief travels by cart. The human heart can learn strange maps to keep eating and sleeping. It can walk past a locked door for years and never touch the handle. Even those who suspect something is wrong find a way to bless it. They say the Harrisons bear a secret illness. They say the twins are touched. They say anything that keeps them from saying murder. Up the slope near the cedar there is a patch of ground where the grass grows thin. At noon it looks like any patch on any farm. At dusk it looks like a lid. Flat stones without marks line the edge near the fence. Once or twice a year someone lays a wildflower there and leaves before the dogs bark. No one speaks of this place, yet the county feels it the way the tongue finds a cracked tooth. Children are told not to play by the fence. They learn not to ask why. Silence is their first custom here. So the story opens with a fine house, a respected name, and a pattern treated like weather. A storm can sit on the horizon for years and still be called pretty. The Harrisons wave from their porch and receive waves back. They feed the hungry at harvest, give coins at Christmas, and print thanks in the paper. They seem to prove goodness can be counted. But goodness that is counted is not the same as goodness that is true. Behind the white paint, a different arithmetic works in secret with hard totals no visitor sees. Each new birth adds another line to that sum. The ledger is almost full. The quiet that has kept the house safe begins to buzz like trapped air. Soon a hand that has never reached will test a handle. When it turns, what was kept inside will step out, and the polite town will have to look with both eyes open. The births no one questioned will ask their questions back. Tonight, Elizabeth Harrison carried herself like a figure carved from calm, a woman whose presence was enough to ease the laboring breath of frightened mothers. In the Virginia countryside, she was praised as both matron and midwife, a woman of grace who moved with quiet certainty and never faltered under the weight of blood or pain. Neighbors came to her door with baskets and whispered blessings, convinced her hands were touched by God. She returned their kindness with a smile that warmed their hearts, though none of them knew that warmth was no more than a mask, stitched carefully over the coldest logic. Behind her gentle touch lay a mind devoted to rules of her own making, a secret arithmetic that demanded every gift of life be balanced by loss. She believed no child could survive unless its twin was returned to the silence it came from, and she treated this belief not as faith but as science. In her private world, birth was not simply nature's chance but a ritual, a transaction she was chosen to oversee. When 2 infants cried in her arms, she would look not at their faces but at their weight, their pulse, the faint way their eyelids trembled. She was meticulous in choosing who would stay and who would be taken, as though she were cutting diseased vines to save a crop. She convinced herself she was merciful, that she was ensuring survival rather than doubling the chance of frailty. In truth, it was not mercy but obsession, sharpened into ritual. Elizabeth believed the family's name and bloodline demanded sacrifice, and she bore that role with a devotion more frightening than hatred. Her methods reflected that devotion. There were no violent acts, no crude marks left on the small bodies. Instead, she devised ways that looked like nature had simply claimed its weaker half. She prepared linens heavy with lavender water, laying them across the chosen twin so gently it appeared no more than a cradle of comfort. The scent disguised the panic of final breaths, turning death into what seemed like peaceful sleep. Other times she tucked weighted quilts around the tiny frame, pressing down just enough to still the chest without leaving a trace. To the outside world, these children appeared to fade quietly, as if the breath had been too fragile for the world. Elizabeth did not waver, did not flinch at the fading cries. Her eyes stayed steady, convinced she was conducting a holy duty. The precision did not end at the act. Each loss was recorded with the care of a scientist. In a hidden journal bound in dark leather, Elizabeth wrote not only names and dates but details of the ritual. The color of the skin at the final moment, the strength of the surviving twins' first cry, the scent in the room, even the position of the moon through the shutters. Each line was a confession written not as guilt but as proof of order. She believed the records would one day show that the Harrisons endured because of her careful hand, that their fortune and health were built upon sacrifices no one else had the strength to make. To her, the journal was a scripture, and every entry was a verse. Her family never dared confront her. Jonathan, her eldest son, grew to understand the rhythm of the house but chose silence, while Clara, her daughter, was forced to obey. Yet it was Elizabeth who ruled the estate's breath. She was the one who decided who was strong enough to live and who was destined to be returned. Her authority grew not from fear but from the illusion of kindness. She was always gentle in public, always soft-spoken, carrying herbs to neighbors and whispering prayers over their sick children. She became a figure of trust so complete that suspicion never dared form fully in anyone's mind. How could such a woman who comforted the weak also extinguish her own with such calm? The contradiction was the heart of her power. Evil that roared could be challenged, but evil that whispered, that wore the face of nurture, could root itself deeply. She understood this truth instinctively. She wore her calmness like a veil, smiling at church gatherings, listening to sermons with her eyes lowered, speaking of patience and faith to young wives. Behind her eyes, though, the ledger of births and deaths ticked onward, each sacrifice feeding her conviction that she alone held the secret to the family's survival. The townspeople told each other that God had chosen Elizabeth as a guardian of mothers, never knowing she had chosen herself as a guardian of bloodlines. They trusted her because she gave them something to believe in, and that trust gave her room to continue. Each time she performed her ritual, she grew more certain that she was right, that the sacrifices were not cruelty but currency. She began to believe the surviving children carried strength not by chance but because she had made it so, binding them to life through the silence of their twin. The Harrison estate became a place where appearances soothed the eye, but the air inside carried the faint weight of lavender and death. Elizabeth kept her secrets with the patience of a spider spinning its web, each thread invisible until touched. She smiled, and the world smiled back, never daring to imagine that behind her calm gaze she had already decided who must live and who must not. To her, every cradle was not a place of welcome but an altar, and every twin born beneath her roof was a test she was bound to answer. And so her hand kept steady, her journal kept full, and the family's legacy grew taller while beneath its roots something unspeakable was buried alive. Jonathan Harrison grew up in a house where silence weighed more than speech, where the air of each birth was followed by the same suffocating stillness. He was the first surviving son, the child who lived because his twin had not. The truth of this was never spoken aloud, yet he felt it in the marrow of his being. From the time he could walk, he saw the pattern play out. The rush of footsteps through dim hallways, the smell of lavender rising thick in the air, and the muffled cry that weakened until it stopped. He never asked his mother why, for the answer was already known, though never given shape in words. Jonathan learned early that questioning was dangerous, that silence was the only language that kept him close to her. He buried the questions not in faith, but in thought. Books became his refuge, the only place where patterns could be dissected without punishment. He studied natural philosophy, the new science of heredity, and the writings of men who spoke of blood as if it carried not only sickness, but destiny. While his peers recited verses or practiced farming, Jonathan filled notebooks with theories about lineage, survival, and the hidden arithmetic of families. He convinced himself he was not the child of horror, but the observer of it, elevated by the distance of study. In truth, he was not distant at all. He was steeped in it, shaped by it, and he recorded every act with the detachment of a surgeon who cannot admit he feels the cut. At night, when the house grew still, Jonathan returned to his desk and transcribed what he had seen. He never wrote plainly, never dared commit his mother's actions to words that could betray her. Instead, he built codes. He replaced names with symbols, lives with numbers, deaths with carefully drawn marks that looked like mathematical proofs. Each journal entry became an equation where 1 child equaled strength and 2 equaled ruin. He did not write of suffocation or lavender-soaked linens. He wrote of adjustments, balances, and corrections. To the unknowing eye, his notebooks appeared filled with harmless puzzles. To him, they were chronicles of sacrifice, proof that his family was governed not by cruelty but by an eternal law. Jonathan's detachment was not passive but chosen. He believed emotion was a weakness that belonged to outsiders, to neighbors who pitied graves they could not bear to look at. He did not see death in his home as tragedy but as data, something to be studied and understood. When he watched a twin fall silent under his mother's hand, he did not cry. He noted the timing, the color of the lips, the strength of the other child's first gasp. His gaze was calm, almost clinical, as if he were confirming a principle of nature. Where others would feel horror, he felt clarity. He saw the deaths not as endings but as experiments, proving a theory written only in his family's blood. By adolescence, he no longer needed guidance. He began to anticipate the outcome before his mother acted. He would look at the newborns and weigh them in his mind, calculating which life would be preserved and which would be extinguished. Often his judgment matched hers, and when it did not, he never corrected her aloud. He simply noted the difference in his coded book, treating the divergence as one might record a failed trial. He grew skilled in masking his interest, wearing the same quiet face at church, nodding at sermons, reciting prayers with a voice that carried no tremor. Yet behind his lowered eyes his mind ran relentlessly, dissecting scripture as though it were only another coded text that hinted at sacrifice beneath its words. His peers at the academy admired his intelligence but whispered of his coldness. They said he had no laughter, no warmth. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words came with an unnerving precision, as though each thought had been weighed before release. Professors praised his insight on matters of heredity, never knowing that his understanding came not from books alone, but from years of first-hand observation. Jonathan never confessed the source. He relished the secrecy, convinced it gave him an authority others could never reach. To him, the Academy's discussions of natural selection seemed like children's games beside the realities he had witnessed. Jonathan did not simply record events, he reshaped them in his mind into a grand design. He believed his family was chosen, that their survival across generations was proof of a hidden covenant. Where his mother clothed her acts in the language of devotion, Jonathan clothed them in the language of science. He told himself the Harrisons were proof that bloodlines required pruning, that nature itself demanded balance, and that without sacrifice no legacy could endure. He found comfort in this thought, for it removed guilt and replaced it with purpose. He was not a witness to cruelty, he was a scholar of truth. By the time he reached manhood, Jonathan had built an inner world that no one could pierce. In public, he was courteous, reserved, and intelligent. In private, he was the archivist of his family's most terrible secret, turning the cries of infants into footnotes and their silences into proofs. His journals grew thick, coded volumes stacked beneath his bed, each one recording the ledger of his family's survival. He told himself he was preserving knowledge, but in reality he was preserving the coldness of his own heart. In Jonathan, the legacy of silence found its perfect heir. His mother acted with the belief she was serving God. He acted with the belief he was serving science. Both paths led to the same conclusion. Death was accepted not as tragedy but as necessity. And so, as the years passed, the Harrison estate did not weaken but stood taller, its wealth and health admired by all who looked only at its surface. No one could see that beneath the polished exterior a scholar sat alone at his desk, scratching coded notes into the night, his hands steady, his mind colder than the graveyards that ringed the countryside. Elizabeth Harrison's methods were never still. Over the years they grew sharper, more intricate, as if each sacrifice had taught her something new about control, about how to silence life without leaving behind evidence. What began as heavy linens pressed across a newborn's face became something closer to ritual. Each act performed with a precision that blurred the line between devotion and obsession. She no longer thought of these deaths as moments of choice, but as necessary ceremonies that had to be carried out with care. In her mind, she was preserving her family, guarding them from weakness, and ensuring their future through a process as orderly as a prayer. She believed that a sacrifice done poorly was worse than none at all, and so she perfected her cruelty until it became a craft. The swaddling cloth was her first refinement. She began steeping the fabric in a mixture of lavender water laced with finely ground poppy seeds. The herb soothed, the narcotic dulled the breath, and together they lulled the weaker twin into a final sleep. To any who entered the room, the child appeared calm, its chest rising less and less until the silence was complete. Elizabeth spoke of it later in her journals as a gift, a gentler passing than nature might give. To her it was not murder but returning one child to silence so the other could take its place in the world without burden. The scent of lavender clinging to the air became the family's secret perfume of death. But her mind did not stop with one method. She grew restless with repetition and devised another way, one that left no trace even for the most watchful eyes. She had a carpenter carve a cradle from dark wood, its hollow bottom filled with fine ash warmed by coals. Into this she laid the chosen twin wrapped loosely so the body sank into the heat. The ash pressed against the mouth and nose, and the child's final breaths left no marks of struggle, no evidence for suspicion. When Elizabeth lifted the body again, it seemed as though it had simply slipped away in its sleep. She believed the ash carried symbolism, that the child's last moments returned it to the earth before ever truly touching life. Each ritual drew its power not only from its result but from the order with which it was done. Those outside the family never saw these things. What they saw were baptisms. They gathered at the churchyard to witness Elizabeth and her husband presenting one healthy child dressed in white, carried with reverence to the font. No second infant was ever mentioned, no coffin ever prepared in public view. When neighbors asked in hushed tones, Elizabeth explained that the twin had been too weak to live, claimed by God before it could be named. The explanation satisfied them not because they believed it, but because disbelief would demand action. To doubt her would mean accusing a respected matron, a woman who had delivered their own children and prayed at their own tables. So they chose to nod, to murmur sympathy, to avoid the chill that asking questions would bring. In this way, the community became part of the ritual. Each silence was a stone laid over the truth, building a wall that kept suspicion at bay. People did not want to believe cruelty could wear a gentle face, so they convinced themselves it was not cruelty at all. At gatherings, they praised Elizabeth's strength, her composure in the face of sorrow, her resilience after so many losses. They admired the way she could speak calmly of God's will, never guessing that her calm was born not of grief, but of certainty. Her reputation became her shield, and their trust became her tool. The more time passed, the more secure she became. She no longer feared discovery. She watched neighbors avert their eyes at every baptism and understood that complicity had infected them as deeply as obsession had infected her. Each family preferred to protect its own peace rather than disturb the balance by accusing the Harrisons. And so, year after year, another child was born, another twin silenced, and another baptism held. The cycle turned like a wheel no one dared stop. The grave truth was that Elizabeth had woven the entire town into her ritual. By refusing to question her, they allowed her to continue. Their silence echoed hers, each omission feeding the next. In her journals, she wrote of this as confirmation. She noted not only the deaths, but the reactions of others, observing how no neighbor pressed further, how no minister asked more than one polite question, how the community itself seemed to bend around her like branches bending away from a strong wind. She recorded these silences with the same precision she gave to the deaths, believing they proved her work was not only right, but necessary. To her, the quiet agreement of others was evidence that they too felt the truth. even if they could not admit it aloud. The Harrison estate remained polished, its grounds neat, its family admired. But inside its rooms the air grew heavy with the weight of ritual. Each infant silenced by cloth or ash was not only a child lost, but another layer of protection woven around the secret. Elizabeth believed the house itself had become consecrated by these sacrifices, every brick and beam holding the balance she had created. The neighbors continued to nod and smile, careful not to look too long, careful not to hear what lingered in the silence after the baptisms. They thought themselves innocent bystanders, but in truth they had become silent witnesses bound by their refusal to speak. The ritual of quiet suffocation endured because it was hidden in plain sight, dressed in lavender and ash, shielded by community trust. What should have been unthinkable became habit. What should have been unbearable became routine. And as the years passed, the boundary between faith and cruelty blurred so completely that even those who doubted did not dare draw a line. In that failure, Elizabeth found her greatest power. The silence of the town became her accomplice, and the deaths of the twins became not tragedies but confirmations that her hand, her logic, and her ritual were stronger than the conscience of all who surrounded her. Clara Harrison grew into womanhood beneath the shadow of her mother, a shadow so heavy it felt like a second skin she could never remove. She was Elizabeth's only daughter to survive past childhood, and from her earliest years it was clear that her survival had tied her to a duty she could not refuse. Where her brothers were allowed to study or inherit land, Clara was drawn into her mother's private world, a world bound not by scripture or law, but by the rituals of silence and sacrifice. She was not taught the gentleness of midwifery, not shown the joy of new life, but instead groomed to serve the ritual that had haunted their family since her first memory. The chamber became her burden. It was a locked room deep within the house, always dim, the shutters kept closed no matter the season. Inside were shelves lined with jars of herbs, coils of binding cloth, and instruments that had no name outside of their use here. Clara's task was to keep it ready. She swept the ash from the carved cradle, measured out the poppy seeds, and soaked the linens in lavender water until the air was sharp with the scent. She was ordered to fold them neatly, to place them within reach of her mother's hand, to prepare the ground for what was coming. The work seemed small on the surface, but it carried the weight of a grave. Every task was a step toward silence, every preparation an invitation for another life to be ended. Clara learned to move without words, to keep her eyes lowered, to perform her duties while her heart splintered inside her chest. Each birth left a wound in her that would not heal. She stood outside the door and heard the muffled cries of the twin chosen to be sacrificed, the sound rising in panic and then fading into nothing. In those moments she felt herself breaking, her soul fracturing like thin glass struck again and again. She wanted to scream, to run, to throw the door open and tear the linens from the child's face, but fear held her. Fear of her mother's gaze, fear of the punishments that followed even the smallest act of disobedience. So she stayed frozen, trembling in the hallway, her hands gripping her dress until her nails dug into her palms, listening as another silence fell heavy across the house. When her resistance showed, Elizabeth made her pay. Disobedience was not met with blows but with punishments designed to reach deeper, to carve obedience into her soul. At times her mother shaved her hair to the scalp, stripping her of the identity that made her feel human. Other times she was forced into the chapel, made to kneel on the hard floor for days, her knees swelling and bleeding until she could barely stand. She was given no rest, no food beyond what was needed to keep her alive, and ordered to pray until her voice cracked. These punishments were meant to cleanse her of weakness, to remind her that her life was not her own, but bound to the duty her mother demanded. The cruelty was masked as discipline, as if pain could carve away rebellion and leave only obedience. Clara learned to wear her obedience like a mask. She kept her eyes lowered, her words soft, her movements careful, so that her mother believed she had submitted. But inside she carried a storm of despair. Every birth forced her deeper into the contradiction. She was both servant and prisoner, complicit and unwilling. She hated her own hands for folding the linens, hated her own silence for allowing the cries to end. Yet she could not find the strength to defy. Each ritual etched another line into her heart, convincing her that escape was impossible, that the walls of the Harrison estate would never let her go. The community saw none of this. To them, Clara was a quiet daughter, dutiful and well-mannered, standing beside her mother with folded hands at baptisms. They mistook her silence for modesty, never seeing that it was the silence of a captive. No one questioned the hollowness in her eyes, the way her smile seemed painted on, the way her shoulders bent as if under a weight no one else could see. They accepted the surface, and in doing so, they left her alone in the grip of her mother's ritual. In her rare moments alone, Clara would touch the scars on her knees or trace the uneven growth of her hair, reminders of the punishments that bound her. She dreamed of a life where births meant joy, where her hands could hold without guilt, where her silence did not make her complicit in death. But the dreams always ended with the sound of muffled cries dragging her back into the reality she could not escape. She told herself she was powerless, and in that belief, her obedience deepened. Elizabeth had crafted her daughter into a tool, and Clara carried out her role with a trembling devotion born of fear. She did not choose this path, yet each act tied her further into it. The chamber remained her burden, the rituals her prison, and her silence the price of her survival. With every child silenced behind the locked door, Clara's spirit weakened, but her mother's will grew stronger. The Harrison legacy was being shaped not only by the hands of Elizabeth, but by the fractured obedience of the daughter who could not break free. Beneath the Harrison estate, below the polished floors and warm parlors where guests were received with charm, there was a cellar no visitor was meant to see. Its stone walls sweated with dampness, its air always carried a faint sweetness, and from behind its locked door came sounds that did not belong to barrels or bottles. This was the chamber Elizabeth Harrison had built not for wine, but for memory. A place where silence was bottled and arranged with care. The dead twins, the children who never reached the light of baptism, were not laid to rest in churchyards where eyes might wander. They were preserved, kept within glass jars filled with thick honey that sealed and masked the truth. To Elizabeth, this was not desecration, but devotion. She believed honey protected the flesh, and in keeping the bodies whole, she believed she was guarding the living children against sickness. The jars lined the walls like soldiers of a secret order, each one holding a small form curled unnaturally. The limbs stiffened but held forever in suspension. The honey dulled the features but never erased them. Tiny faces pressed against glass, mouths frozen in silence, eyes sealed but seeming to accuse. Over time, the light from the lantern made their shapes shimmer so that stepping into the room felt like walking into a congregation of ghosts, each jar a silent witness to a life stolen and catalogued. The dripping sound that visitors sometimes overheard was not wine trickling but honey seeping from cracked lids, the slow leaking of years, thick and golden on the stone floor. When questioned, Elizabeth smiled calmly and spoke of wine storage, of syrup barrels, of a family recipe no one needed to disturb. Her words were steady and no one pressed further. In her journal, she wrote of the chamber as if it were a library. She recorded each jar by placement, noting which shelf, which row, which corner of the cellar held which child. To her, this was order. Without such order, the family's future would be vulnerable, their health unguarded. The preserved twins in her mind were guardians, their silent watch a shield of protection for the living. She saw no horror in the collection, only purpose. It was not enough for the twins to be silenced. They had to remain. They had to stay with the family and body, bound to the house so that the sacrifice could continue to exert its power. Jonathan understood and even admired the design. He read his mother's records and added his own coded notes describing how the preserved bodies seemed to resist decay, how their presence coincided with the strength of the surviving children. He saw this not as coincidence but as proof of their theory, that life demanded balance and that preservation was part of that balance. He wrote of the jars as though they were specimens in a grand experiment, their grotesque forms transformed in his mind into evidence of law. For Clara, however, the chamber was terror. Each time she was forced to enter and clean the jars, wiping honey from the glass, she felt the dead eyes upon her. She tried to look away, but the sheer number of jars made it impossible. The shelves grew crowded, the cellar heavy with the weight of preserved silence. She could not step inside without feeling surrounded, her breath catching in the sickly sweet air until she thought she would faint. The chamber changed the house itself. It gave the estate a core of rot beneath its clean facade, a hidden heart that beat with stolen lives. Even the servants whispered of it when they were alone, though none dared voice what they truly thought. They spoke instead of strange smells drifting through the floorboards, of dampness that never dried, of the faint hum that seemed to rise from beneath at night. Guests sometimes remarked on the locked doors, on the sound of dripping echoing faintly during supper. But Elizabeth always had an answer ready, her calm smile never faltering. People preferred the explanation of wine or syrup to the darker truth their instincts brushed against. Over the years, the collection grew into something monstrous. Rows of jars stretched from wall to wall, their shapes turning the cellar into a grotesque archive, each one a reminder of the ritual that had built the Harrison legacy. To an outsider, it might have seemed a madwoman's obsession, but to Elizabeth and Jonathan it was structure, evidence, and faith combined. They believed that as long as the preserved twins remained, the family line would endure. The house, in their eyes, was fortified not by bricks or money, but by this hidden congregation of silenced children. In quiet hours, Elizabeth sometimes walked among the jars with a lantern, her gaze steady, her lips moving in whispers that no one could hear. To her, the chamber was sacred ground, not a place of death but of preservation, a vault where sacrifice was kept eternal. She would pause at each jar, pressing her hand against the glass as though greeting an old friend, as though thanking them for the life of the child who had lived in their place. She felt pride, even comfort in knowing she had kept them close. It was her proof that she had not wasted their deaths, that their silence had meaning. For Clara, those visits were unbearable. She saw not guardians but accusations, rows of twisted little forms watching her with faces that had never known daylight. She could not enter without trembling, without feeling her chest tighten as if the honeyed air was pressing down on her lungs. Each jar seemed to speak to her in silence, asking why she had not stopped it, why she had folded the linens, why she had obeyed. The cellar became her private torment, a place that haunted her sleep and drained her spirit. But she never spoke of it. The fear of her mother's punishments, the memory of shaved hair and bleeding knees, bound her voice as tightly as the lids bound the jars. The chamber of preservation stood as the most grotesque expression of the Harrisons' hidden order. It was a place where innocence was not only silenced but displayed, a collection that turned murder into legacy. The family lived above it as though nothing were amiss, smiling at neighbors, attending church, speaking of God's will. Yet beneath their feet, the preserved twins waited in their glass coffins, a silent chorus watching. A grotesque archive of lives stolen for a legacy no one dared challenge. And with each new birth, the collection grew, and the dripping of honey echoed louder in the dark. In the summer of 1876, when the river swelled with heat and the cicadas hummed endlessly in the trees, Reverend Isaac Walker first came to the Harrison estate. He was a traveling minister, a man accustomed to the shifting roads of rural Virginia, whose sermons carried a sharpness that unsettled those too comfortable with silence. The Harrisons intrigued him from the start. Their reputation was one of spotless piety, their donations to the church generous, their attendance unwavering. Yet behind the polish of their devotion, he sensed something unspoken, a current moving just beneath the surface. He had seen such currents before in towns where appearances were worshipped more fiercely than God, and it was always in such places that darkness hid the deepest. It was the records that drew his first doubt. At the parish, he studied the baptismal book, running his fingers down the inked names. Each Harrison child was listed neatly with dates and verses marked in Elizabeth's familiar script. But what struck him was not what was written, but what was absent. Year after year, Elizabeth bore twins, a fact whispered by midwives and known in passing by neighbors. Yet only one child per birth was ever recorded in the book. There were no entries for the others, no mentions of death or burial, no coffins lowered into consecrated soil. It was as if each second child had vanished into the air, leaving behind only gaps that the ink refused to fill. The Reverend knew records rarely lied, and these omissions were deliberate. When he visited the estate, his eyes were not only on the family but on the house itself. He noticed the shutters on certain windows always closed, the faint odor of herbs that clung too heavily to the halls, the locked doors that groaned when the servants passed them in silence. Elizabeth greeted him with calm courtesy, offering tea and speaking with a gentleness that might have fooled any man less attentive. Her face carried no flicker of guilt, no trace of nerves. She spoke of God's will, of the burden of many children, of the sorrow of infant mortality. Her voice never broke, even when the Reverend pressed her lightly about the missing records. She answered with sorrowful tones, claiming the children had been too weak, that they had passed before they could be named. Her words were measured, her calm absolute, as though rehearsed 100 times before. Jonathan was different. The young man met the Reverend's gaze with a scholar's detachment, weaving arguments that shifted the conversation away from faith and toward philosophy. He spoke of heredity, of survival, of how nature selected the strongest and how families endured through balance. His words carried no warmth, only logic sharpened to the edge of cruelty. To others he might have seemed merely intellectual, but to the Reverend the precision was unsettling. It was not the talk of grief or reverence, but of experiment. Each phrase seemed to mask a deeper conviction, one not built on scripture but on some darker belief. The Reverend left those conversations feeling chilled, as if Jonathan's mind was more dangerous than Elizabeth's silence. Clara was the one who betrayed the strain. She stood behind her mother, her hands folded, her eyes never steady. The Reverend noticed the tremor in her movements, the way her lips parted as though she longed to speak, the fear that held her tongue each time she met his eyes. More than once she seemed on the verge of confession. Her voice would catch, her breath quicken, and her body lean forward as though her secret pressed at the walls of her chest. But always her mother's hand would tighten at her side, or her brother's gaze would fix upon her, and the moment passed. Fear sealed her mouth as surely as the locked doors sealed the truth beneath the house. The Reverend began to return often under the guise of spiritual duty, but in truth he was driven by suspicion. He asked about the family's health, about their history, about the children who had not lived long enough to be baptized. Elizabeth always had answers, and Jonathan always had explanations, but the Reverend felt a weight behind their calmness, a precision too perfect to be innocent. He listened to their words but studied their silences, noting how often the air seemed to grow heavier when he entered a room. How often Clara's face grew pale when he spoke of God's judgment. At night, in his prayers, Reverend Walker felt the disquiet deepen. He could not yet prove what his heart told him was true, but he sensed a covenant in this house, a hidden order that clothed itself in piety while feeding on silence. It was more than grief, more than misfortune. It was deliberate. He thought of the locked cellar, the smell of herbs, the omissions in the book. He thought of Elizabeth's unwavering calm and Jonathan's cold detachment. He thought of Clara's trembling silence, a silence that seemed to beg for release. The estate stood as it always had, proud and admired, but to the Reverend it had begun to resemble a temple built to a god no one dared name. He left each visit with the sense that the house itself was watching him, that behind its polished shutters something waited in the dark. Though he could not yet prove it, he knew the Harrisons guarded a secret that was heavier than grief and older than denial. And with every unanswered question, his suspicion grew. A slow flame that would not be extinguished, even as the family tightened their smiles and closed their doors. The storm came without warning, sweeping across the Virginia hills with a violence that shook shutters and split branches. Rain battered the Harrison estate, Lightning cut across the sky, and in that chaos, Clara Harrison's silence finally fractured. Years of muffled cries, of folded linens and jars of honeyed death had hollowed her spirit until nothing remained but guilt. She could no longer bear the weight of the cellar pressing beneath her feet, no longer carrying the shame of being her mother's obedient accomplice. As thunder cracked overhead, she fled her chamber and sought out Reverend Walker, her trembling steps guided not by courage but by desperation. The storm seemed to mirror her own collapse, each flash and crash tearing down the walls she had built around her conscience. When she found him, she spoke in gasps, her words spilling as if they had been waiting for years. She confessed what no one in the town had dared name aloud, her voice breaking as she told him of the chamber, of the preserved twins, of the rituals her mother had perfected in silence. Reverend Walker listened, his face pale in the flicker of lantern light, the enormity of her words cutting through even the roar of the storm. Clara's eyes shone with the frantic brightness of a soul unburdening itself at last, yet her body shook as though each word risked bringing death upon her. Fear and relief mingled in her trembling frame, but she pressed on because the truth had festered too long and now demanded release. The Reverend followed her to the estate, rain soaking his cloak, his boots sinking into the mud as he moved with grim purpose. Clara led him to the locked cellar door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the key she had stolen from her mother's apron. The lock groaned, the door opened, and the smell met them first. That thick, sweet odor of honey and damp stone, a smell that clung to the air like decay disguised as sweetness. Lantern light fell into the darkness, and the Reverend saw what words could never have captured. Row after row of glass jars stretched across the cellar walls, each one filled with golden liquid that held within it the curled, distorted form of a child. Tiny faces pressed against glass, limbs stiff and twisted, hundreds of eyes forever closed yet screaming in silence. The Reverend staggered at the sight, his breath caught between horror and disbelief. He had suspected much, but the reality was beyond suspicion, beyond imagination. It was not a handful of jars, not a hidden few, but an entire archive, a grotesque collection that revealed decades of ritual sacrifice. The cellar was a vault of death, a place where innocence had been stored like wine, each jar a testament to cruelty perfected and preserved. Clara collapsed to her knees, sobbing, her voice breaking as she whispered apologies to the preserved dead, as though she could beg forgiveness from those she had failed to save. The lantern flame wavered, casting shadows across the jars, and it seemed for a moment that the entire cellar was alive with silent accusation. When the storm cleared and the Reverend carried the truth to the community, the reaction was swift yet fractured. People gathered in disbelief as he told them what he had seen, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Some wept openly, others denied it outright, claiming such a thing could not be true of the Harrisons. But whispers turned to shouts as the story spread, and soon a group of townsfolk forced the cellar open for themselves. When they saw the jars, the honey glistening in the lamplight, the truth could no longer be hidden. The room filled with gasps, with the sound of prayers cut short, with the choking horror of neighbors who realized they had been complicit all along by their silence. The cellar was no longer only Elizabeth's vault. It was now a mirror held up to the entire community. The Harrisons did not crumble easily. Elizabeth denied everything with the same calm that had carried her through every suspicion. She called Clara mad, unstable, a daughter weakened by imagination and guilt. She spoke of syrup stores, of traditions misinterpreted, of enemies twisting stories to ruin the family name. Jonathan, too, defended the house, speaking with cold logic, dismissing the Reverend's claims as hysteria and superstition. He argued that the jars were harmless experiments, preserved specimens misunderstood by frightened minds. His words carried an authority sharpened by education, and some among the authorities hesitated, uncertain whether to believe the minister's horror or the family's unshaken composure. The law moved slowly, cautious, and uncertain. The Harrisons were wealthy, respected, their name carved deep into the county's history. To accuse them outright was to risk tearing apart the fabric of the community. Officials visited the cellar, but records were quietly altered. Evidence explained away, questions left unanswered. Some jars were removed, destroyed before they could reach the eyes of outsiders. Others remained, hidden again behind locked doors. The truth was too heavy to be carried easily, and the town, though shaken, yearned to return to silence. Yet the cellar had been seen. The jars had been touched, and the memory of their contents could never again be buried. Clara was left broken in the aftermath, her confession dismissed by her family as madness, her loyalty severed by her own honesty. She became a ghost within the estate, avoided, silenced, yet forever marked as the one who had dared to speak. Reverend Walker continued to preach, his sermons sharper, more urgent, but he knew the full reckoning would never come. The Harrisons would deny, the authorities would stall, and the town would retreat once more into complicity. Still, something had shifted. The silence had collapsed, if only for a moment, and in that collapse the truth had been seen. Above the cellar, the house stood proud as ever, its windows polished, its porches swept. But beneath, in the damp dark, the jars remained, rows of honeyed death glistening in the shadows. A silent chorus that would never again be unseen. The storm had torn open what the family had hidden, and though denial pressed against it, the weight of the truth would linger, seeping like honey into every corner of the town's memory, too heavy ever to be forgotten. The Harrison estate did not fall in fire or ruin, but in something colder. Scandal that rotted its name from the inside. Once admired as pillars of piety and wealth, the family became whispered about in doorways, their legacy carried not by pride but by suspicion. The cellar of jars, once the hidden core of their ritual, was emptied under the weight of public outrage. Neighbors demanded the destruction of what they had once ignored, and so the jars were smashed, the honey and small bodies buried in silence outside consecrated ground. Yet, whispers said not all were destroyed. Some claimed a portion had been hidden away, carried off by Elizabeth or her loyal son, tucked into secret corners where glass still gleamed faintly in the dark. The town never knew for certain, and that uncertainty became its own kind of curse. The scandal reached beyond the estate, seeping into law and practice. Across Virginia, the state tightened its grip on midwifery, demanding records for every birth, demanding explanations for every death. Infant mortality could no longer be written off as chance without oversight. Certificates became required, inspections made routine. Elizabeth's rituals, cloaked in secrecy for decades, had forced the state to stare at what silence could hide. Though the Harrisons were never formally tried, their legacy twisted itself into laws designed to prevent another family from practicing devotion through death. The Harrison name became the shadow beneath reform, an example no one cited aloud but that haunted every signature of new oversight. Clara disappeared into that shadow. After her confession and the storm of discovery, she was seen less and less, until one day she was not seen at all. Some claimed she fled into the hills, others whispered she was buried by her family in an unmarked grave. Her vanishing became another silence, one that the town folded into its growing list of things left unsaid. Yet her absence lingered like a wound, for she had been the only Harrison to break the silence, and for that, she had been erased. Jonathan lived on, but in isolation. His journals, filled with coded records and cold arguments, were locked away in a chest that no one outside the family was permitted to open. He aged alone, his mind devoured by the theories he had once believed gave order to his life. When he died, his body was found in a chair by his desk, his pen still resting in hand, his last page unfinished. The chest of journals was sealed and stored, its contents too disturbing for the town to confront, yet too precious for the Harrisons who remained to destroy. Some say it still exists, carrying within it the true arithmetic of their cruelty, a record of how death was turned into ritual and ritual into belief. Elizabeth herself was buried without honor. Her grave was left unmarked, avoided even by her kin. Families who had once praised her name now crossed the road rather than walk past her plot, as though proximity alone might spread her legacy. The woman who had cradled life with one hand while extinguishing it with the other left behind no stone, no epitaph. Nothing but the memory of her calm face and the horrors hidden beneath it. Her life was erased in public, but in private her name lingered like a whisper one people dared not say aloud yet could not forget. The Harrison curse did not end with their deaths. It lived on in the laws that sought to close the silences they had exploited, in the stories passed quietly among neighbors, in the unease that clung to the estate even after its windows were shuttered and its rooms emptied. It lived on in the question that gnawed at every conscience. How had so many seen and chosen not to see? The jars were gone, the cellar bricked over, the family dispersed. But the truth remained that evil had thrived in plain sight because it had worn the mask of nurture. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it cradles, whispers, and smiles as it extinguishes life. Sometimes it hides behind prayer, behind reputation, behind the silence of those who prefer comfort to truth. The Harrisons proved that cruelty can live for generations beneath a roof admired by all as long as no one dares to name it. Their estate is gone. Their bloodline withered, but the legacy of their silence lingers. What do you think? Could this happen again, hidden within families who protect their name at all costs?